So for those who aren't familiar with Jim Baker, can you say what positions did he actually have that gave him so much power?
Yeah, I mean, it was remarkable. He was the chief of staff to Ronald Reagan in his first term, Secretary of Treasury in the second term, and then Secretary of State for George H.W. Bush during the end of the Cold War and the prosecution of the first Gulf War. But even more importantly, I think, he also ran 5 presidential campaigns, and that's a unique skill set in Washington. Somebody who can both be a campaign operative and then also a statesman at the highest level. And I think it's like Karl Rove and Henry Kissinger all on the run, right? You know, Henry Kissinger didn't run any campaigns, Karl Rove didn't negotiate peace treaties. Baker was playing on both levels.
So for those who aren't that familiar with Jim Baker, he was a good friend of George Herbert Walker Bush, a tennis buddy, and he actually managed George Herbert Walker Bush's presidential campaign in 1980. It didn't get to the campaign result that they originally wanted, and then Bush became vice president, or vice presidential nominee. But then after the election, Ronald Reagan decides to have Jim Baker, who ran a campaign against him and actually ran Gerald Ford's campaign in '76 against Reagan. Why would they pick a person who ran 2 campaigns against Ronald Reagan be the chief of staff?
You know, you're exactly right. I mean, first of all, it tells you something about the nature of infighting in Ronald Reagan's inner circle, that in a way they wanted to bring in an outsider. I also think, you know, Baker, one of the things he was a very canny reader of, the power map wherever he was. And, who liked him was Nancy Reagan. She thought, this guy fits the suit. And he's somebody who will represent my Ronnie. What they didn't want was Ed Meese, who had been Reagan's chief of staff back in California. Yeah, exactly, when he was the governor of California. And so it was not only a blocking maneuver, but you could argue that Baker's running of that 1980 campaign for George H.W. Bush, it got them both promoted, right? It got vice presidency for George H.W. Bush, and many people would say that Baker himself became the most powerful man, aside from Reagan, in Reagan's first term.
Now, George Herbert Walker Bush is elected president in 1988. Baker runs his campaign, and so the first decision that he makes, Bush as president-elect, is I'm going to make Jim Baker my Secretary of State. Yeah. And did Baker love that job? Was that the best job of the 3 he had?
Loved that job. Best job he ever had, absolutely. But what's really fascinating about that transition is how he makes that move from partisan warrior in the campaign, running a campaign that was not gentle. It had the Willie Horton ad, it had, the flag and the Pledge of Allegiance and all that stuff when Bush beat Dukakis. And then as soon as it's over, weeks after that election, and George H.W. Bush has just named him Secretary of State, what is Jim Baker doing? He's at the Watergate apartment of Jim Wright, who was the Democratic Speaker of, Bob Strauss, Bob Strauss, the chairman of the Democratic Committee, having dinner with Jim Wright, the Democratic Speaker of the House, because he says, let's figure out a way to end the Contra War. In other words, partisan until the election, find bipartisan solution afterwards. And that's what's so different about Washington today.